Hi everyone, welcome to this session of the Belong Online Literature Festival, or BOLF, which is an initiative of Belong, a social venture that seeks to bring discrimination-free services and experiences to people who face identity-based discrimination. We run programs for inclusive housing, inclusive mental health, inclusive research, as well as a book club and library for inclusive literatures. You can learn more about these on www.belong.net. Before we begin, we want to acknowledge the tireless efforts of our festival partners, our media partner, The Wire, our cultural partner, the British Council, and our accessibility partner, Access to All, without whom this event would not have been possible. Now on to today's session. The session is on Becoming Indian, Migration and the Indian Identity with Jonathan Gill Harris and Rana Safvi. The session will be moderated by Sangeeta Barooah Pisharoty, a Delhi-based author and a national affairs editor at The Wire. Prior to joining The Wire in 2015, she worked at The Hindu for about 14 years. She won the Ramnath Goenka Excellence in Journalism Award for feature writing in 2017. In 2019, her critically acclaimed book, Assam, The Accord, The Discord, was published by Penguin India. Now on that note, Sangeeta, I hand over to you.
Thank you. I welcome everybody to this interesting topic, Becoming an Indian, Migration and Indian Identity. To discuss this, I have with me two very interesting people. Rana Safvi is here. She is a Delhi-based author and the founder of the online poetry forum, Shire. Rana's The Delhi Trilogy, where stones speak, historical trails in Mehrauli, the forgotten cities of Delhi, and Shahjahanabad, the living city of Old Delhi, and tales in the Quran, Hadith. This makes her a prominent name in the list of Delhi chroniclers. And she's also a translator. And I say Rana's introduction won't be complete if I don't mention that she is a passionate believer in a centuries-old syncretic practice of Ganga Jamuni Desi. Welcome to the discussion, Rana.
Thank you so much, Sangeeta.
And our other panelist is Jonathan Gill Harris. He is an author and professor of English at the Ashoka University in the National Capital Region of Delhi, where he also served as the founding dean from 2013 to 2017. Professor Harris specializes in Shakespearean studies and is the author of 10 books, including Masala Shakespeare, How a Firangi Writer Became Indian, and their best-selling The First Firangis, Remarkable Stories of Healers, Heroes, Courtesans, Charlatans, and Other Foreigners Who Became Indian. Must say one of my favorite books. And Professor Harris is currently writing a book about Jews and the Silk Route from Persia to China and India. So, Professor Harris, I would come to you first. I want to first look at the first part of this discussion today, Becoming Indian. Because we feel that it is closer to how you look at yourself, or at least what, and also the subjects that you deal with. So my question to you would be, what led you to embark on this journey of becoming an Indian? Just for the listeners' benefit, I also like to add here that you spent your childhood in New Zealand. You spent a long period of your adult life in the US before settling down in India in 2030. So how do you negotiate through these various issues, maybe daily issues, around adopting and adapting to a new or a different way of life in a new country? Because certain things are also inherent, certain things you may be able to adapt, certain things are just there. So how do you deal with those? Of course, looking at it from your personal experiences, and also drawing from some of the fascinating characters that you had brought to us through your first book, the First Firangis. Over to you, Professor Harris.
Thank you, Sangeeta. Well, I should issue the caveat straight up that I'm not Indian. This may surprise everyone looking at me right now, but I'm technically an overseas citizen of India. Because both my, a lot of people assume that I'm writing, assume correctly that I'm writing autobiographically, but assume incorrectly. The process of becoming Indian has an endpoint where you become Indian and bus over. The thing is, I don't think I can ever fully become Indian. And that's partly because I can't ever leave the traces of where I've been fully behind. They come with me wherever I go. I mean, I've found this in particular learning Hindi, that my New Zealand palate stubbornly refuses to give up certain habits. So for instance, all the differences between t and t and t and t in Hindi, my ear can't quite hear, my mouth can't quite manage. And so, you know, I will always carry with me the trace of being other. But I think it's also fair to say that there's a way in which that's true for so many people who are also Indian citizens.
Correct.
And the question is, what do we mean by Indian? Beyond some completely sort of banal sense of being a citizen of India. Right now there is a huge battle going on over the definition of what it means to be Indian, over and above Indian citizenship. There's a huge battle going on over the question of who is entitled to be Indian or to become Indian.
Right.
And whereas 5 years ago when I wrote the first Farangis, I think I wrote it in a spirit of gratitude and optimism. When I came here, I felt like I was accepted in a way I'd never been in all my peregrinations around the world. That, there was a level of hospitality I encountered here from people all over the subcontinent, not just India, by the way, but other parts of the subcontinent, that made me feel very much at home. 5 years later, I think what it means to become Indian is very different. And I feel far less optimistic than I did right now. What it means to be a migrant is something very different now. When we use the word migrant to refer to other citizens in India, it's clear that there's been a radical transformation of thinking about migrancy and Indianness. Now, just to go back to my book and some of the stories that you referred to, what I wanted to do in my book, The First Farangis, was remind, not tell, but remind my readership that India is and always has been a land of migrants.
Right.
No one comes simply from here. You go back one generation or many generations, the trail always leads somewhere else. And it's important for us to recognize that because so much of the subcontinent consists of communities that have, like me, become Indian without fully becoming Indian, that retain some vestigial trace of elsewheres, whether it's Parsi communities or for instance, the B'nai Menashe community of Mizoram, who have a strong cultural memory of coming not only from other parts of Asia, but also from Israel originally.
Correct.
But what I wanted to do was tell the stories of Europeans who'd come to India before the age of colonization and who had come not to conquer, but who'd often come as sort of very poor migrants escaping political conflict, escaping economic hardship. Remember, Europe, until the age of colonization, was really a very, very poor backwater. It was a plague-infested backwater for much of the Middle Ages. And it was a backwater that was suffering from the yoke of feudalism and an often very austere form of Christianity that didn't permit certain types of minorities to live comfortably, whether they were religious minorities or sexual minorities. And so I was looking at people who left Europe, who hadn't necessarily intended to come to the subcontinent, but who ended up here nevertheless, and who, by hook or by crook, picked up Indian languages, picked up Indian customs, clothes, ate Indian food, sometimes settled down with Indian partners, and to all intents and purposes, adapted. Many of their descendants today are what we call Paka Indians. And so one of the effects of this migration was that these people, who often left a very, very negligible trace in the archive, because many of them were illiterate. They weren't part of the dominant narratives of, say, Mughal Hindustan or other parts of the subcontinent. But they contributed their labor, their artisanal skill to all sorts of endeavors that we now very much think of as quintessentially Indian. So take, for instance, the Takte Tavus, the peacock throne.
Right.
We think of it as the Mughal throne as sort of an emblem of Mughal power, even Indian power, and those Persians, Nadir Shah, and took it away from us. But the Takte Tavus, I mean, it was worked on by many people, but one of its chief designers, as far as we can tell, was a man who is described in the Tuzuki Jahangiri as Hunarmand, a Persian term that means skillful. And he was a Farang. As far as we can tell, this Hunarmand was a man named Augustin Iriard, who was a Basque escapee. He was escaping the law in France because he'd been set up in France, actually in England, in a case of counterfeiting. And so he got the hell out of Europe, somehow made his way to India, found service with Jahangir because he was very good at counterfeiting rubies, and Jahangir didn't mind where the lookalike rubies came from, whether they were made cheaply or not, so long as the bling looked good. And he said, I want you to make me a really good throne, which is what Hunarmand, Augustin Iriard, proceeded to do. This is just one of many examples of ways in which foreigners came here and somehow became part of something that we now regard as quintessentially Indian. Now this wouldn't be possible in quite the same way because we're seeing a narrowing of the sense of what it means to be Indian. And with the CAA too, we're seeing an increasingly exclusive and exclusionary sense of who gets to count as a potential Indian. I'll just finish by noting two groups of people who have traditionally had a significant presence in India, Muslims and also Jews, are not part of the list of people who qualify for inclusion as refugees from neighboring countries to become Indian.
Yeah, right. I actually am so glad, that you pointed out these whole issues around migration, who, and over years, over centuries, become Indian, and with this great example of the peacock throne. And, some of the, longest running actually kingdoms in this, what we know of India today, in the Indian map, are all from by people who came from outside. I mean, in my region where I come from Assam, 600 years of rule by the Ahoms, who actually came from one part of Myanmar. And today they are a very important part of the Assamese or Assam identity, So, and that is again a state where we see that who you may be, and you may be considered an Indian, but you may not be considered an Assamese. The identities, they get into another kind of a tangle. And then, of course, it's the whole CAA thing that you have pointed out. You may be living in this country for many years, but then your citizenship is again coming under cloud. So, and particularly because we belong to a particular community. So these are issues we will keep coming back to when we continue this discussion. I'd like to go to Rana now, mainly to engage her first with the second part of this topic, migration and the Indian identity. Rana, you are there?
Yes, yes, I am
Yeah?
listening to both of you.
Okay, I'd like to give a little, I mean, like maybe a slightly longish preamble to this question, because it is so important to highlight in today's times, you know, after what Professor Harris said, that, you know, many things have changed now. So it is very important for us to keep reminding ourselves about the diverse India that we have today, and which is also the result of so many types of migrations, assimilation, and coming together of various identities to weave a composite and specific Indian identity. So, and migration, as we just talked about, is a civilizational reality. So therefore, the Indian identity is also, when you look at the Indian map, or the variety of people, even physical looks, you know, the physical variety. You say, you know, a dark complexion, big-eyed Tamil is also an Indian. A fair complexion, tall, thick is an Indian. A high cheekbone, small-eyed northeasterner like me is also an Indian. So, you know, that what does it say? It talks about this great story of migration, which is a civilizational reality. So I remember you, I would like to take you back to this one piece you wrote in 2018. I think it was for Scroll. This was after watching this Hindi film, quickly playing film Morphed, where you talked about, you know, a reminiscence about growing up with this feeling of being an Indian, amidst this Ganga Jamuni Tehzeeb of Uttar Pradesh in the 1960s and 70s. And yet, a few decades later, now what you see, you rightly noted there in the piece that you're seeing a change in India, a change being engineered on the very architecture of that Indian identity as we have known it. And of course, there are a lot of fallouts you're getting to see. And there is an attempt to bound that Indian identity within the presence of only one dominant religion, while India has been home to so many religious beliefs, and also for non-believers. So in this, there is no denying that a member of the Muslim community is facing the brunt of it. What I want you to talk about a little bit is also how has the community, you know, how has life around you or in your surroundings has changed because of it? What are the things that you noticed around you?
So thanks for this question, Sangeeta. And I'd like to start by adding to what Gil said, that my ancestors migrated to India from Iran in the 14th century. So we come from a place called Hamadan, and they came here and they said via Kashmir, and they settled in this small village near Aligarh. And this village has been even mentioned by Ibn Battuta in his Rihla. And so we've been there, and we never thought of ourselves as anything else except Indian. And during the partition, when both my grandfathers, my maternal and my paternal grandfather, they were very senior. My paternal grandfather was a member board of revenue, and at the time of partition, my maternal grandfather was the president of the Banaras estate and the Diwan of Banaras. So, you know, both of them were moved by the people asking them to, you know, migrate to Pakistan at that point of time, as many high-ranking Muslim officers and people were. And I remember my nanas, I have heard this ever since I've been born, I've been hearing this, that my nana said, "Ki wahan ke khuda ko mera salam kehna," meaning that there is only one God, and that God is everywhere. So this question of an Islamic state is just nonsensical. There cannot be an Islamic state because God is everywhere. After all, He's Rabbul Alameen, so He's everybody's God and He's everywhere. So this was the story I grew up with, and which I mentioned also in that piece. That when my grandmother, who never ever saw movies, went to see Garam Hawa, she was crying. I think I was 16 or something at that time. And it didn't register to me. Well, why is she crying in this movie? Because what I saw was a tragic love story in the movie. Of course, they saw the tragedy of partition. And I remember my mother telling me as a child, because some of her uncles and aunts did go to Pakistan, that, जो वो दस्तरखान होता है, जो बिश्ता है, that every day the दस्तरखान would start getting smaller and smaller. People migrated. That's a story that they've shown in Garam Hawa. They've shown that. So she said, that is a reality that we also saw. And but luckily, not many people from my family migrated. Most of our family has stayed in India. So I get, when I hear people telling me, go to Pakistan, and I wonder, why go to Pakistan? We could have gone when we wanted to, we had to. But we never wanted to do that. And we grew up here and grew up in a very, very syncretic culture, and grew up amongst everybody. And see, India is has a civilizational legacy of a lot of migrations, of a lot of communities coming here, living together, and what we call the composite culture. Today they are trying to make a composite culture mean there's only one culture, but composite culture means that it's an integration of many cultures who came and who are reacting and interacting with each other spontaneously, taking something, giving something, and they exist with their own separate identity. So have we. I identify myself as somebody from Awadh. If you ask me my basic identity, I would say as somebody from Awadh. I write about Delhi, but I still see myself as somebody who is from Lucknow, who has been born and brought up in Lucknow, and that's my primary identity. I would identify with that first of all. But now that is no longer the identity that I am being given. The identity that I am being given by people is that of being a Muslim, something I never considered, as something that was a public identity. That was my identity at home. It was the faith that I believe, the religion I believe in, the faith that I practice. But it was a very personal thing. It wasn't something I wore on my sleeve when I went out. But now the community is under attack from every side. It's always, whether it's this the COVID-19 crisis, where it was called Corona Jihad and things like that. There's always some kind of question being raised on the community. And unfortunately, now I find myself sometimes, like defending myself as a Muslim, not as an Indian. Because that is the identity that I am being made to feel the most conscious about. And that I feel is very tragic, because I am an Indian, I have grown up in India. Wherever my ancestors came from, that is irrelevant. Many waves of migration came to India. Everybody adopted India, Indian customs and Indian traditions. And of course, Indian culture. And I've lived in the Middle East for many years, for almost about 10, 15 years. And I do not identify with anything in the Middle East. I identify with everything, in India. Or as I said, Awadh, that is my, any person belonging to any religion or community in Lucknow would be closer to me than, say, somebody living in Saudi Arabia or in Dubai, because that is what I've been brought up with. And that is something that we are being told that is wrong. And no, there is only one culture, there is only one religion, and only one language. No, the language which we call today Urdu was actually Hindi, and it's a mixture of so many languages, and it's such a beautiful language. And Persian, which was the official language of India for so many years, was more popular and written about more in India than in Persia in the 17th and 18th century. So, these are facts of life which we have to understand, that what we have today is the result of a spontaneous interaction of many cultures, a lot of give and take, and a lot of evolution for us to have reached where we have today and to be what we are today.
Right, yeah. So I have another question for you to after this. Because I'm also myself very quite curious about it. You are also from an upper middle class, English educated family from the Muslim community with liberal views, where all your sisters descend for higher education. So you don't fall into that typical media image of a Muslim woman, a Sahara, a mother of many children, uneducated, keeps herself under the veil, ignorant of modern ideas, etc., etc. So obviously you have had access to the wider liberal society in India, where such religious bigotry, I would presume, be highly disapprove. So can we say that your access to that society is still ample, or even that world is shrinking?
See, I'd like to say that education was something that was stressed on by both my grandparents. And everybody, like from my mother, they were all highly educated. My mother did her post-graduation in 1948 at a time when women were hardly studying. It didn't matter which community you belong to. So for us, education has always been something that, as my grandfather would say, that this is something knowledge is something that nobody can take away from you. And that ilm will always stay with you. So that is your biggest treasure and that is your biggest earning. So, and that there's never any age for learning. So that was something that was stressed upon. But we were all, the bigotry does not mean that anybody who's very religious is a bigot. I'm extremely religious, but that's my personal faith. And that I like to think of myself as being very spiritual. I'm a practicing Muslim. I say my prayers 5 times a day. I do all that. But, when bigotry comes from not understanding your own religion and not understanding the other person's religion. So that again is something that was stressed upon in our family. I have a very good knowledge of all religions, all faiths. We were encouraged to read books and educate ourselves about other religions. And bigotry comes only, as I said, if you don't understand. And to understand my own religion as well. It's when I understand my own religion that I know that there is no space for bigotry. And as Hazrat Ali said that, there is this very famous instructions by him given to Malik Ashtar, who was going as the governor of Egypt when Hazrat Ali, that is Ali ibn Abu Talib, who was the 4th Caliph of Islam, when he was sending Malik Ashtar as the governor to Egypt, he gave him a set of written instructions, sent him a letter. And in that he says, everyone is either your brother in humanity or your brother in religion. So that is what we have been brought up with. So there is no space for bigotry. Bigotry comes from illiteracy and from not, I'm not talking of education, because education does not make you, can only teach you literacy. It may not, make you broad-minded. So bigotry comes when you understand and when you read a lot, you open your mind. And that liberal space is, yes, shrinking, because now we have stopped accessing, we live in the Twitter world, where we are either living in a 140 character world or now a 280 character world. We do not bother to read. We do not bother to, like, as children, I remember we would be encouraged and told that if we have to read the classic. And for every book I was very fond of reading, I read, I think, non-stop until almost 10, 15 years ago. And for every, I was very fond of Enid Blyton's and all these books that were popular about 50 years ago. But my father made it a point that for every week we had to read a classic. And we had to talk to him about it. And there would be dinner table conversations on the classics that we read, whichever, whether it was The Wuthering Heights, Charles Dickens, or whichever books we were reading. So that is what gave us a great sense of what the world is all about. And we would also read Urdu books. We would also talk about everything that was going on. Premchand was again a popular author in our family. There would be a lot of discussions on Shakespeare as well as Milton, Browning, and Ghalib and Mead. So we had a very broad education. Today, that space has shrunk because we are no longer reading as much. We are spending more time on social media. A lot of my friends who friends who've been friends for about 40, 50 years, we used to think alike, are now getting swayed by WhatsApp. So yes, in that sense, the liberal space is shrinking. But then in another sense, if you see the ladies of Shaheen Bagh, in that sense, the world is not shrinking, it's expanding, because these people who had so far been confined to within our identity and within the 4 walls of a house came out and they broke stereotypes. So it is, as they say, the best of times and the worst of times. And it's what we choose to make of it for ourselves. So there are identities, very fluid identities at the moment of people coming out of their 4 walls and people retreating within their mobiles and their WhatsApp, into their mobile and WhatsApp world, and believing everything that they're fed in spite of fancy education that they've had.
Yeah, right. I would like to slip in a little bit of, another world that I have also grown up in, in Barooah, Assam, where, we had this old 100-year-old temple in my family, and next to it was a rented house where for many, many years there was a Muslim family that stayed in that. And today I just sometimes think, whether that even that reality is not going to be there anymore. So what has changed? I mean, this is like it happened in my childhood. So these things are changing, but also certain positives are also happening. What you pointed out about the Shaheen Bagh being pushed against the wall too, and certain things also happen, to which we saw. And I'd now like to go to Professor Harris. We understand that you're attracted to India and you study India. India is also the locus of your specialization in Shakespearean studies. My question here is two parts. One is, of course, does it absolutely require you or anyone to become Indian, to become one of us? I'm using this us in a very identity sense between us and them in that sense. So is it absolutely required? And I'm asking you this question also from my own experience. As I said, I come from the Northeast, and when over 2 decades ago I came to live in India, in Delhi, my initial tendency was to look for affinity and embrace them, the local cultures, and try to locate myself within it. Where do I find myself? But when the other, at the same time, the other was actually looking at the differences, even the physical differences. So, but I gradually realized that I can be an Indian too by unabashedly embracing first what is my own, even while living in Delhi. So, aside from my initial question, I would also therefore like to ask you, did you go through any of those phases or anything, those initial thoughts that you'd like to share with us? What you said is like, now you're not too sure, but what was your, what was there in the mind space then?
So, I mean, there's a lot in your question, Sangeeta. And that simple pronoun, us,
Yes.
I think is critical here. It can be such a welcoming and affirming and consoling pronoun when you're included in it. It can also be deeply violent.
Right.
So us is always defined against them, or tends to be defined against them. And this does relate a little bit to what I was talking about before, vis-a-vis becoming Indian. What do we mean by Indian? What do we mean by us? And if us has shrunk to a simple homogenized hum, then I think there's a problem. When us is understood simply as those who subscribe to a certain set of values that are under the umbrella of some people's definition of the majority religion, then I think violence is being performed with that pronoun, us. I mean, this actually relates to a story that I often tell that was vital to sort of my initiation into India. Way back in 2001 was the first time, at least in my adult life, I'd visited India. I'd been here briefly as a child, but that's sort of beyond my memory now. But in 2001, I was here, and I went to the Chanakya Theatre in Delhi to see Lagan. And I'd seen Hindi films before in small art house cinemas in Britain and the US on video, but nothing had prepared me for the experience of being in a huge single screen cinema hall. It was an extraordinary experience because there were about 2,000 people crammed into the Chanakyapuri cinema that day. But I remember being absolutely, if you'll pardon the pun, bowled away by Lagan. And not just the story. I mean, the story, let's face it, is fairly dreary and predictable. It was what happened along the way that the team that Amir Khan's character puts together, Bhuvan, Yes, it's a Bollywood fantasy of India, but at least it's a capacious fantasy. In the cricket team, there's Muslim, there's Sikh, there's even Dalit. It's coached by a woman from England who is at odds with her evil brother. But what I remember, not from the initial screening, because at that time I didn't understand any Hindi, but I fell so in love with the songs that that's how I began to learn Hindi. So when Amir Khan's character sings, or rather Udit Narayan sings through him, "O mitava, sun mitava, tujhko kya dar hai re, ye dardi apni hai." So it took me a long time to get used to the word apni, apna. I couldn't quite translate it. It was just sort of given to me as this land is ours. So I thought, why is it not hamara? Because I'd also learned that as a synonym as translation for ours. And I realized there was a world of difference after a while between apna and hamara. Hamara suggests possession and often a uniformity. Kashmir, hamara hai, is actually a very violent statement. But ye dardi apni hai, it can span so many people, not only the people from different backgrounds who are part of the cricket team, even a culture shocked Firang like me in the audience was embraced by that. So I think the word us is something that we need to look at very closely and to ask ourselves, what do we want we to mean? Do we want we to be something singular, homogenous, that is violently policed against others, especially the proximate others just across the border in that other country, or proximate neighbors who belong to the other religions? Or do we want we to be something capacious and inclusive in the way it was in Lagan and the way it was, I mean, I've fallen so deeply in love with Hindi cinema from the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Because one of the big, I think, myths about Hindi cinema is that it's not straightforwardly Hindi. It's always been Hindi plus, Hindi and Urdu, Hindi and Punjabi, Hindi and Bhojpuri, Hindi and English, even Hindi and Marathi and Tamil. And I remember a time still when I first came to India that screens would always include credits with titles in English, Devanagari, and Nastaliq. That's changed. And I think the films we're seeing now, no matter how well-intentioned they are, no matter how progressive they might be by depicting, say, a gay relationship or depicting women in a progressive way, something fundamentally unprogressive and homogenizing has started to happen in the way in which we think about what we means in Indian cinema, at least in Hindi cinema. Sorry, that's a very long and roundabout answer to your question.
Lovely, actually. Yeah, because, it's so important. That's why very deliberately I asked you this us and them. This has been, we need to also explore that and understand what is us and what is them, and what is how inclusive us can be and how exclusive can it be also. So it's interesting. Thank you so much. I would like to go to Rana now. You mentioned about Urdu, as the language. I'd like to draw your attention to what you wrote some time ago in your blog. My name is Urdu and I'm not a Muslim. There's a very beautiful line there. It says, "But today I am an orphan in my own country." The existence of that very language signifies the syncretic Indian identity. So would I would say the creation of a religion like this Din-e-Ilahi in the Mughal era. So unfortunate that it is, I want to ask you, is this Dinist status of Urdu today and the tendency to identify it only with the Muslim community, not on the expected lines post-partition? especially when it became the official language of the newly created Islamic nation, Pakistan. Because I want to bring in the partition bit here, because when we talk about the Indian identity, this us and them thing, and what we are seeing unfolding now, partition is something very, a very important development here, and we cannot just keep it aside and talk about it. Rana, do you hear me?
Yes. So first of all, Professor Shamsur Rahman Farooqi has done a lot of work on this particular subject, that the word that we call Urdu now was not used for the language. Urdu was the name of, like, the city of Shahjahanabad was called Urdu-e-Molla, the exalted camp. The language that was spoken there was Zabane Urdu-e-Molla. It was actually called Hindi. And when they wrote in that, because before that Farsi was the spoken language, as well as the literature and poetry was written in Farsi. But when they started writing it in Hindi, it was called Rekhta. So the poetry was Rekhta and the language was Hindi or Hindavi. And Urdu, as I said, it was Zabane Urdu Molla, but from that the word Urdu comes, and it's a mixture of so many languages. The tragedy of Urdu now, since now the language is called Urdu, was that because it was written in the Perso-Arabic script, it became associated with the Muslims. It was never a Muslim language. We have Chakbas, Pandit Brij Narayan Chakbas, whose poetry is sublime, especially a couple of his verses. We have so many. Premchand was writing in Urdu. Munshi Premchand initially was writing his in Urdu. Ex-Prime Minister Dr. Manmohan Singh still writes in Urdu. So does Gulzar. So, this thing that if you say that Urdu is the language of a particular community, that is again an identity that has been forced onto this language. And languages do not have religion. If let us
what a
say
beautiful line. Yeah, I was mentioning, when Bangladesh was formed, you see, it's based on language, so, yeah.
So, say a Bengali Muslim would be speaking in Bangla. They would not be speaking in Urdu. A Muslim from Kerala will be speaking in Malayalam, whereas anybody from Awadh will be speaking in Urdu. So, that is why what I mean to say that, to try and identify somebody or some language as that this language is called Urdu, this language is Muslim. So as that there's this very famous poem by Iqbal Ashar where the last line is कि मैंने तो खुद क्यों मुझको बनाते हो तासुब का निशाना, मैंने तो खुद को कभी मुसलमान नहीं माना. So why do you make me a target of your bigotry? I have never thought of myself as a Muslim. Now that it's a beautiful line, but it's also a tragic line. Why should a language have to defend itself against a religion by saying that I don't belong to that religion, so don't target me? It just shows the amount of targeting of a particular community that is being done. And as Gil, you said it so beautiful, apna aur hamara. So this us versus them argument is what is the most harmful. That, okay, acha, आप उर्दू बोलते हैं और like so many times you talked about the fact of my belonging to an upper class liberal family. What I used to find the unkindest cut used to be when people said, अच्छा आप मुसलमान नहीं लगती, अरे तो क्या हमारे सर पे दो सींग थोड़ी होने चाहिए? So what does a Muslim look like, that I have two horns on my head or what? So these are things which are very, very disturbing to me, and which I try to keep writing about. And all my writings are on syncretism. Even my translations, when I did my translation, Dastane-e-Ghadar or The City of My Heart, even Asarul Sanadid, these translations were all aimed at bringing out the syncretism of a particular period, that is the 19th and the early 20th century, and to show the kind of society that was in Delhi and nearby Lucknow that we were living in, and that is the society more or less that we grew up in. And by the time I was old enough, the scars of partition had healed. And also that depends upon us, because partition was very traumatic on both sides. I cannot get away from that fact that there was a lot of bloodshed and there was so much of religious targeting and of course killing and murder that is there. I've talked to people in Old Delhi some of whom, stayed back at that particular time, and a lot of people in 1947 from Delhi were going to Pakistan. There are these families there who are, of course, now the gentlemen are in their 90s, 80s and 90s, who did not go. And they tell me we didn't go because we didn't want to. Like as I said, my grandfather, he said, "Ye to hamari zameen yahan pe, hum to yahi marenge. Jahan hamara family kabristan hai, that's where we want to be buried." So we associate ourselves or identify ourselves with the land that we have lived in, where our ancestors are buried in. So this fact of identifying a language or identifying a structure or identifying a person by their religion is deeply troubling for me. Because if you want to see me, you see me as the person that I am. I may be good, I may be bad. See me for what I am, for what I do, for what I represent, not for the language, religion that I belong to.
Yeah, lovely. It is so beautifully. Yeah. It's so important to now keep reminding ourselves of this. And my next question is to Professor Harris. Again, of course, dealing with this Indian identity as an amalgam of diverse cultures or of people migrating, to different parts over centuries and making this land their own. One such group we don't talk about much is the remnants of the Raj era, the Anglo-Indians. I grew up with many of them in my area. Many from that community have, of course, contributed to the betterment of this country. And yet we saw a recent move by the Indian government to abolish the reservation the community had in the Rajya Sabha, the upper house of parliament. How do you see such a move, to bring India again under a homogeneous identity by actually discarding those parts of the past that many so-called representatives of the majority Hindu community would consider more of a subjugation of the Indian culture, traditions, or the Indian civilization? And I must also highlight that this is happening at a time when the British Parliament is increasingly turning brown.
I'll answer this very quickly because, to be honest, I'm not much of an expert on Anglo-Indians, and I'd love to hear also what the audience have to say. But what I'll say is that, of course, historically there have been two versions of Anglo-Indian. One is English people, or people of English origin who were born in India. Usually colonists or the children of colonists. And then there are the Anglo-Indians who are the product of miscegenation, intermarriage between people from Europe and India. And although there are a few people still living in the subcontinent who I think are descended mostly from Britain. I once was in Flurries in Calcutta, and I was ordering some rum truffles and was getting excited about getting them into my mouth. And this woman with long blonde hair bustled past me and started ordering, even though I'd been in line before her. And I was about to say, bloody tourist, when I realized she was ordering in Bangla. And it suddenly occurred to me, oh goodness, she's a local. But it's the mixed Anglo-Indians that I'm interested in. I think right now our country is having a lot of difficulty wrapping its head around the idea of mixture. Mixture is a category.
The masala that you talked about in your book,
masala-ness. And masala, mixture, used to be such an integral part of our understanding of who we are. It's interesting that it was the British who came along and set up separate electorates for Muslims and Hindus and decreed that Muslims, at least in the north of India, are Urdu speakers. And so they had to invent a language for the Hindu electorate to speak. So it became Hindi after Urdu, which involved a partition of language as well as of people. But even as late as the early 20th century, there was a British census in Gujarat, and some 2 lakh people identified not as Muslims or Hindus, or for that matter as Jains. I don't think the category existed in the British census, but as Mohammedan Hindus. You know, they
Correct.
didn't fit in either or box. And right now we're seeing something of that happening now with Anglo-Indians. Anglo-Indians have been forced to decide, are you European or are you Indian? And if you're Indian, then, you know, like it or lump it, but there shouldn't be a reservation for you. I think many Anglo-Indians are struggling in both environments to find a sense of self, or rather not to find a sense of self, but to find an environment that can embrace a sort of double-barreled or mixed identity. Anyway, that's my quick answer. I think we have a problem with mixture, and I think we need to sort of review some of our historical traditions to understand how we have traditionally embraced various types of mixture. Even the idea of the hijra is a mixture. In Hindu mythology, Vishnu becomes Mohini. It's possible not to be hostage to an either or mentality, but to inhabit a both and mentality.
Right.
It's possible to be both Indian and also Pardesi at the same time. I'd like to think that I'm sort of straddling that cusp, although in very different ways from many other people because of where I've come from, certain privileges that I have as a white immigrant to India. But still, all of us are mixed in various ways. And the problem is that we think people should be should. And we need to embrace a little bit more ashutta, a little bit of impurity in our lives to recognize the capaciousness of human experience.
So true. Yeah, I'd like to take you back quickly to, you know, what is unfolding in India is also a phenomena we are witnessing in various degrees across the globe. And like look at US, you know, a nation like the US, where people from dozens of countries came together to create that American identity, is today trying to be only white. So my question to you is this trend of striving for this so-called purification of identity more of an offshoot of a faulty economic model, or maybe of the bad governance here too? Because when we see this recent Black Lives Matter campaign in the US, it points at an unequal life in a first world country.
I think there are many contributing factors. I think one is, of course, the Sangh Parivar's agenda of purification. I think there are also all sorts of other local factors, but I also wouldn't rule out a global move towards ethno-nationalism that we're witnessing all over the world right now. This is not to let India off the hook at all, but it is to recognize that what is happening now is to a certain extent a consummation of a process that began with British imperialism, but also Soviet imperialism, even latter-day Ottoman imperialism. The early Ottoman Empire was much more multicultural than the later version, which seems to have caught a virus of ethno-nationalism that spread through Europe and that is being acted out now. I've always said that the BJP should stand not for what it claims to stand for, the Bharatiya Janata Party, but for the British Janissary Party. I think the BJP, even though it claims to be Swadesi, is continuing the work of the British through divide and rule, through the singularization of identities that were always much more capacious and plural than they used to be. What attracted me to India, to go back to your first question, one of the reasons I moved here was I thought there was room to be many things here in a way that I hadn't felt in many of the other places I left. I feel that room is shrinking very rapidly right now, but that's not happening just in India, it's happening the world over.
Correct, yeah. Rana, I would like to go to you, my last question for you. At a time when these, DVC forces are trying to tear the fabric of the syncretic India, what, according to you, can those resisting it must do?
First of all is education. And education, I don't mean, just going to college and school, but educating ourselves about each other and embracing each other. and also stopping this constant barrage of us versus them, this state-filled hashtag. You know, that is something we have to fight. We have to keep talking about the syncretism with which we've always lived, and which is what I get attacked for most often. You know, when I'm attacked on social media, I'm not attacked ever because I never talk about anything which is divisive. I'm always attacked when I talk about things that are unifying. If I say that in the Red Fort, Raksha Bandhan was celebrated, I'm attacked for that. I'm abused for that. So, but anyway, I carry on regardless, because once I know that I'm sure of my facts and I'm accessing narratives which are written in the 19th and 20th century, so I know what I'm talking about. But we have to embrace that. We have to stop seeing each other as us versus them. We have to see each other once again as a single homogeneous community, interacting with each other spontaneously, you know, accepting and give and take that which we live forever. And also we have to, you know, like this WhatsApp is what has been, I keep going back to that the biggest harm that, or the most harm that has been done in the past 6-7 years to us as a country and as a community have been these very hate-filled WhatsApp that have been circulated. And also because, you know, so many people had no idea of actual history, because they may have read a little bit, especially if you see these IT cells, they're full of people from tech backgrounds who have not had exposure to a liberal arts program. So that is where we have to, you know, like keep talking about our past. We have to keep talking about the liberal values that we inherited. And as Gil said, the room for people, that there is so much room for everybody. If I want to go up, I don't have to pull down somebody. There is enough space for me to climb and go up without pulling somebody down. So, you know, like stop all these things, and also stop falling prey to these forces that are trying to divide us.
Thank you. Okay, now at this point, I would like to open the discussion for question and answer session with the listeners. Thank you everyone for being so patiently waiting. And I'm not very good at technology, so I may goof up a little bit, but okay. So yeah, there's a very nice question by listener Lotika. She asked the question, many families are polarized right now, in which as an OCI, I'm being told by my family in India that I can't speak for India as I don't live there. But I have never felt more Indian than now. How are people in polarized families trying to bridge the national, anti-national divide at present? It's a very good question. Rana, you like to take this?
Yes, families are being polarized because, you know, it's become the fashion now that if you say anything against the government, you're anti-national. People confuse that the government and the nation are two separate identities. We have elected the government to govern us. They're elected representatives of us. They are not the nation. The nation is India, and we are all Indians. Whichever party we may be supporting, whether it's the Congress, the BJP, the Samajwadi, the BSP, the DMK, any of them, it doesn't matter. So that is a conversation that's happening, and I know so many families where WhatsApp has split up the families, and people are leaving WhatsApp group because they're saying if we stay in this WhatsApp group, we are going to, you know, like lose family members because of the argument. And as I said again, that these WhatsApp forwards target the emotionally and vulnerable people. It's either the youngsters or the older people. So if say a grandmother or a grandfather or a father or a mother send you a WhatsApp, you tend to believe that, okay, it's coming from somebody whom I respect. So that is where this polarization is coming, and this polarization is coming because of political divide. And that is something we have to understand, Latika, that being critical of a government is not being anti-national, and being patriotic is something that you have to question the government and make it perform. They are elected representatives. If dissent is not illegal, nor is it anti-national.
Right. Yeah. There's another interesting question by Sanjukta Das. She's asking, throughout history, we seem to forget the process of becoming, like Professor Jonathan mentioned. When faced with discriminatory mindset in regular life, in everyday life, how do you invite a dialogue? of becoming. Not everyone wants to engage in history, perhaps are moved by the political propaganda and maybe easy to exist in black and white. How do you encourage pluralism in day-to-day life among the close friends and family? So maybe both of you can deal with this. Rana, actually, I asked you also about this question about how do one those resisting it must do. If you want to add anything new to it.
How do you encourage pluralism in day-to-day life among close friends and family? Except for this year, the past 4 or 5 years, we have been having interfaith festivals. We've been celebrating where we celebrate. First, we started with interfaith iftars, where we'd invite people who'd never been to a Muslim home to come and break their fast with us and to interact with us and see what we were doing. Then we took it forward. We started having interfaith, Diwali, Tej, etc., etc. Because to encourage pluralism, you have to see what the other is. I talked about earlier that it's ignorance where I don't know. Like, for example, I don't know what, Gil is eating. So I may say, he eats this. But if I share a meal with him, I know what he eats and I know that it's the same thing that I eat. I may be a veg, non-veg, whatever, but we are basically eating the same kind of food. So it's, this is a very simplistic way that I'm trying to put it. But this is the same project that Akbar had when he started getting the Ramayana and the Mahabharata translated. That it's only with knowledge of each other's religion that we lose our biases. So to encourage pluralism, I would encourage interaction between communities, between people, encourage your children and yourself to meet. And this is how we grew up, like you're celebrating Diwali, Holi, Eid, Christmas, everything. We celebrated every festival and we didn't live in silos. But today, because of a nuclear family, we started living in silos because parents are busy, children are busy, have been outsourced to technology. So they're busy playing video games, which are very violent. And maybe not, that kind of interaction where the Dada and Dadi and the Nana and Nani the grandparents would tell stories of their shared cultural heritage. That shared cultural heritage is what is missing, and that is what we should be talking about.
So true, yeah. Professor Harris, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, no, I think Rana's said most of what I'd say. I would just say, get offline. I think that this one of the most toxic silos that we've come to inhabit, even those of us who think of ourselves as liberal and open, is living most of our lives online. I mean, that's a lockdown that's in some ways more toxic than what's been going on during the pandemic, that we end up just sort of staring and shouting at screens rather than talking with, conversing with people who are different from us. So I think there's a way in which Facebook, Twitter, all these social media platforms sort of encourage a certain kind of homogenization and tribalization of opinion that makes it very difficult to learn how to negotiate something that is completely outside one's horizon of immediate experience.
There's a very interesting question asked by Indu Manohar, very relevant, I would say. Indu Manohar is asking, who gets to decide who an Indian is? Who is an Indian? Who gets to decide it? Those in power, those in the majority, given that we all carry traces of outsideness, even as we migrate around the country, is the very idea of Indian nationality outdated and irrelevant?
Well, I think I think the very idea of nationalism is already toxic, and I think that who gets to decide? It's a very good question, and practically, who has got to decide? It's government apparatuses. It's the state. I think at moments like these, it's when we start to look for other institutions that might provide some kind of safety net, especially when a state is somewhat violently and narrowly defining what it means to belong to a nation. And that's why it's been interesting to see so many of the protest movements of the last year repose so much faith in the Constitution, in the Indian Constitution, in the hope that the preamble to the Constitution and certain articles of the Constitution will cling on to a certain capaciousness that we're witnessing the erosion of in sort of day-to-day decisions on the part of the state about who gets to be, who qualifies to be.
Yeah, right. Yeah, there's another question I see from Kaveri, but we somehow dealt with that also, but maybe you would like to add something to it. Kaveri is saying that becoming Indian and being accepted even 15 years ago was always very different for non-white foreigners. Are dark-skinned outsiders ever regarded as foreigners in the same way?
Can I briefly answer that? I'm sure Rana has something to say too.
Yeah.
Without doubt. I mean, you know, my experience has been so different, say, from the experience of the African laborers who got beaten up in South Delhi a few years ago. That has to do with certain deeply held racial prejudices here. And I've been the beneficiary, frankly, of those prejudices. But it's worth, as always, going back to history to think about how things might have been done differently, how there were other possibilities available to people, and that continue to be available. So one of the most important phases of subcontinental history was in the medieval period. In the Bahmani state, there was a huge influx of immigrants from Ethiopia. Many of them were forced immigrants. They arrived here as slaves. They got to be known derogatorily as the Habshis, a term based on accent. Some of their descendants live as Siddis now. But it's interesting that many of them rose to positions of considerable power and prestige in the former Bahmani sultanates. So for instance, in the Ahmednagar Sultanate, Malik Ambar became the Grand Vizier. He was a former slave who became the most powerful person in Ahmednagar. And in Janjira, a community that was alternately in the Bijapur and the Ahmednagar Sultanate, Janjira was an offshore island that had a few territories in what is now Maharashtra. It was ruled historically by African Nawabs. And their prime ministers, get this, were Jews. They were Muslim black people with Jewish prime ministers. These are people who now wouldn't be able to immigrate from Pakistan or Bangladesh or Nepal or Sri Lanka to India by virtue of their religious identity. But these were people who had considerable prestige, commanded an enormous amount of respect in the area for several centuries. So there are other stories that Indian history gives us that, and this is an answer to the previous question too. What do you do when you're confronted with people who refuse pluralism, who look at things in literally black and white terms? Read a book, read about your history. It's not what WhatsApp is telling you it is.
I'd like to add something here, Sangeeta, if I may. That, as I said, my maternal grandfather, my Nana, was the Diwan and the president of Banaras state. And the Maharaja of that time, I think the year would have been early 51, 52. He was studying in Mayo College in Ajmer. And Banaras, Ramnagar is famous for its Ramlila. It's a UNESCO event. And the Kashi Naresh, which the Maharaj was, would be on the lead elephant in the procession for during the Sera. And this was a time when obviously schools were open. The young Maharaja was in Mayo College. And my aunt, who was an 8-year-old at that time, was, and she has written this, she's recorded it in her book. There's a family history book called From the Depths of Memory, where she's recorded that she was on the hathi, on the elephant, and as the daughter of the Diwan Sahib. Now see how many stereotypes are being broken here. She's a girl, a young Muslim girl in Banaras, in Kashi, Ramnagar, on the elephant representing the Kashi Naresh, because she's the Diwan Sahib's daughter. And traditionally the Diwans of Kashi Naresh were from my family. And we grew up with that, and with this kind of, so that is, I said, you know, people today, you can't even imagine if you, I was to say that, you know, when you go to Banaras, my father was also posted there, we were given so much of respect, ki Diwan Sahab ki family hai, ye Ramnagar ke Diwan Sahab ki family hai, something, and for us, it was never a question of religion, it was always a question of what we did and what, where we came from. So this is the lived reality. And today, I remember, I think 2 or 3 years ago, I had written for The Wire about this, when Nawazuddin Siddiqui was not allowed to play a character in a Ram Leela because he was a Muslim. And that is when I had written about this, that, you know, so many years ago, after independence, and my aunt is 8 years old, and she's sitting on the elephant in today, which is one of your, it's such an important festival and given the UNESCO tag for Indian culture.
Right.
So
Yeah.
if this pluralism has existed, it is just that, you know, we have to again go back and look for it and share our stories.
Yeah, so important. Yeah, what you said is so relevant that it's there, but we have to go and look for it. There's another question by Rashmi Chakravarti. Rana, if you can take this up. Says that, do you think that Indian literature includes mostly Hindu Brahmanical literature, excluding literatures like the Sangam literature, and does it have anything to do with colonialism?
I think Gil would be the right person to answer
Okay,
this.
yeah, between both of you, yes.
I mean, this relates to the previous question. Who gets to decide what Indian literature is?
Yes.
Because there is so much extraordinary literature that comes from beyond the pale, literally, of Savarna Brahmin writing, Hindu writing, and writing in English. Some of the best writers are Dalit writers, Peregan, for instance, in Tamil Nadu, and Adivasi writers like Hansta Sarendra Shekhar from Jharkhand. There's so much good Indian literature out there that doesn't fit that description. I guess the question is, what gets canonically presented both to the outside world and to Indians as Indian literature? And it's certainly the case that Indian literature in English has been hegemonic on the international stage. This is not to take anything away from what Arundhati Roy or Salman Rushdie or Rohinton Mistry have done. But I hope that in the years to come, we're going to see some of the absolutely wonderful literature that comes from non-English traditions, non-Hindu traditions, translated and made available to larger audiences, both internationally and within India, because of course one of the big challenges is how do you make literature by a Tamil Dalit available to students at a North Indian university, most of whom don't speak Tamil.
True, yes. Yeah, that's a related question. Can you speak about how class and education play a role in being victimized to a great extent? You're dealing with that, so maybe do you want to talk specifically about class and...
Class and education play a role, sorry, in what?
Can you speak about how class and education play a role in being victimized to a great extent? Maybe this is a related question to what you were dealing with.
The victimization, sorry, the sound keeps choking here.
Should I sort of give it a go?
Please. Yeah,
yes,
yeah.
please.
Yeah, so I think the question is about how class and education play a role in victimization. And I think what that means is that how do class and education play a role in deciding who gets to be Indian or not Indian, or become Indian?
Rana, do you want to take that, or should I speak about it?
No, you please go ahead.
Can I just use this moment to lament what is happening at JNU? A narrative has been created about JNU that its students are layabouts who prefer politics to study, which I can say is far from the truth. Having taught at JNU, some of the very best students I've ever taught were there, some of the most committed and diligent and thoughtful students. What I really loved about JNU was that its catchment pool was much, much broader than any university I ever taught in the West. I taught so many students who came from poor backgrounds, who had got to JNU because the university had sort of recognized their ability, and there were accommodations made to bring students of very poor means to the university. And the pressure that's being placed on JNU, including the withdrawal of scholarships for poorer backgrounds, I think is just exacerbating the class chasm within education. I'm proud to teach at Ashoka, but Ashoka is a private university, and of necessity, that means that many people feel the doors have been slammed even before they try to open them. Ashoka does offer a huge amount of financial aid, but it's still never enough. My heart was completely broken last year when I went to Patna. I gave a talk there, and my chaperones were 2 students from Patna University, ferociously bright young people. I think they'd read more than I had read at 21. But they hadn't been able to get into the classroom for about 6 months because of constant political agitation by student politicians. And they were desperate for tips about reading, desperate for tips about how to improve their lot, not just economically, but also intellectually. And I think this is one of the big crises right now in India, is that we're allowing higher education to run down. There's all this talk of institutions of eminence. When a cell phone company gets the tag institution of eminence without even having opened its university, and we're not doing anything to remedy the situation at universities that have worked for so many years, like Patna University, like JNU, then I think we've got a looming crisis that needs to be dealt with. But I'm sure Rana has more to say, and the audience have more questions.
Yeah,
No, I
a lot more questions. So, yeah, Rana, you were saying something.
No, I said Gil has explained it beautifully that you know that JNU has such a big catchment area, and people who could not have even thought of first generation learners. I'm seeing the same thing in Old Delhi where I go, where I see first generation learners, and it's these first generation learners which are our future, because they are the ones who are hungry to learn and hungry to, and they are the ones who will break these stereotypes and go take us forward.
Yeah. So over to Rana. Any last thoughts? Any thoughts that you would like to share?
I think this has been a very fascinating discussion, and for everybody who is hearing us, your identity is what you want it to be. My identity, as I said, it's an Indian identity, but I associate myself most with Amar, and that is my primary identity. Apart from being an Indian, religion was never my identity and will never be my identity. So it's up to you to choose what identity you want to have. And for God's sake, everybody who's hearing, please go and read about our pluralistic customs, the civilizational legacy that we have inherited in India from so many thousands of years of people coming here, living and interacting spontaneously, and hopefully we shall, inshallah, continue living spontaneously like that.
How lovely. Yeah. Professor Harris.
I think that we've got to resist lockdown. And I'm not talking about lockdown against COVID. I'm talking about lockdown intellectually, about confining ourselves to silos, confining ourselves to communities, very narrowly defined. I think we have to recognize what has been truly unique and wonderful about India, which is an ethos of hospitality. And it's a hospitality that is part of many Silk Road cultures, and India is one of them. It's a hospitality to the stranger, hospitality to the neighbor. You are different from me, but I will welcome you. And I remember being so moved when reading about observant Muslims who would keep alcohol in their house, not because they sought to tipple it in secret, but because there was always the possibility that a stranger who does drink alcohol would come to their house and would want some liquor to give them succour after long travel, and it would also induce them to tell a story of some kind. Alf Laila wa Laila, The 1001 Nights, is the great work of literature of the Silk Road, of many, many cultures that told stories to each other. It contains Buddhist stories, Zoroastrian stories, Muslim stories, Hindu stories, Jewish stories. This is very much our tradition. It's why I came here. So please, let's not forget that we're part of a Silk Road. The nation always limits and contains us. The road always leads somewhere else, and there's so many delights from knowing that we're connected with somewhere, not just over the rainbow, but somewhere beyond the horizon.
Thank you. How lovely. Yeah. India, land of many, many cultures. Yeah. That's something that we need to take back with us from here. And on this note, I'd like to end this discussion at my end, and thank a bunch to both the panelists for enriching this discussion, real sharp insights. And I also thank the listeners on behalf of the organizer, also for taking part in this discussion and also being very, very participatory. Stay safe and have a very good evening.
Thank you.
And thank you, Sangeeta.